He wrote the inaugural poem for Obama. Yes.
Okay, that's what it was. Okay.
Shattering stereotypes. That too. He was the first Hispanic gay male who had any sort of presence in a presidential. What's the word I'm looking for? In presidential festivities, and it was so exciting for him to take his position and be able to also tell a story that was very...
Yes, it was incredible.
And it's almost like a willingness to listen even deeper than you might have been able to do prior to his story, if that makes sense.
Yes, exactly. I was going to ask you, can you, just off the top of your head, can you think about a couple of more examples in the book that may stand out to you? Like I mentioned, the one about a little girl. I think that's the one I remember the most in there, and it stands out in my mind because of the trauma she must have went through. But there's others in there, too, that I read. But I'm just going to let you see, maybe you could pick a couple out that you could highlight and tell a little bit of the story of what happened to the women.
Well, I love my fellow editor, Nikki Mustaki's piece about the crank caller. I remember as a kid, that was, you would crank call people, and it was all fun and games, but sometimes you got crank called. And more often than not, those crank calls were kind of menacing, and she experiences that for years and years. And I don't think that today's generation can understand what it was like to have a phone ring at home over and over, how scary that was, say you were home alone. And here this man would call her and say these obscene things to her. After many years and the advent of caller ID, yay for caller ID, she was able to track down that man and realized it was a friend of her parents. A man who had sat at her dinner table, a man who had watched her in her birthdays and Hanukkahs and Seder dinners. And this man terrorized her for, I think, close to 10 years. So that was very powerful, too, because the way we break up the story is kind of like where these violations happen, at home, in institutions, people you know, and then we called them imposters. He was a man who was doubling as a friend of the family, someone safe harbor, right? And here he was the menacer. So that was very powerful to me. It's twofold, that the violation, the grabbing, can be mental and emotional, and that sometimes it hides itself in plain sight. And that's even more upsetting and horrifying.
Yeah,
another one...
And to think of it... Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please.
No, go ahead. Please, go.
Well, I was just going to say, and to think that was someone that, like you said, that sat at the same table with her, that knew her, and that she saw regularly, and that's unbelievable. And then the thought that went through her head then is somebody that she probably trusted, even. So
correct. That her family might have called in a pinch to take care of her. That's what I think about. An emergency happens, friend of the family, oh, well, so-and-so can look after little Nikki. And that is harrowing to think of. And luckily, it was relegated to the phone. But the betrayal, I think about, too, the betrayal that happens when someone you know or love violates that trust. It's important to take note of. But I don't think one is ever the same after that. Another one that I love also is by Oliver Brantome, X Marks the Spot. And they were my student. They are the youngest contributor to the anthology. And that piece was written when they were 17 years old. And that I absolutely adore, because that person has found a voice young. Many of our contributors are middle-aged. We've had time to reflect, to contemplate, to think, to get therapy, analysis. But here we have this young writer who's able to articulate their experience and their pain, and with my greatest of hope, set it down so that their life that is just beginning won't be marred by a violation they had no control of.
That's important too. So that they get some closure in their life, because like we spoke about earlier, people can carry this with them for years and years and years, and then not be able to get the closure they need to move on and to put it behind them. Because it's certainly troubling if they don't. I'm going to remember one more in there that I'm going to speak about briefly here, and that is the one. He was a young man, and his father worked in a meat, I believe it was. Oh,
Virgil Suarez is with the lion on the belt?
Yeah, I think that's the one it is, right, yeah. And he goes, and then he tells, well, the ending, I'm going to jump to the ending here, I guess, and what was so surprising, because, he was being molested, actually, but then at the end of the story, what the shocking part was, that the actual person who was molesting him was then turned out to a semi-hero, because he pushed somebody else, the gunman who killed the people, came in and shot the people. He pushed him out of the way, Do you remember the story? His father...
Oh, I do, and that's one... It's one of my favorite stories by Virgil Suarez. Again, that vulnerability, that telling. I know Virgil is also a friend of mine. He is Cuban, and Cuban men don't talk about things like that. Cuban men are raised to be quite macho, right? So when I got that story from him, again, all of these stories felt like gifts, like they were entrusting me with jewels. And I was charged to take care of them. And his story just highlights how our heroes might not be heroes. Those who we shine a light upon, who we give a public forum to, might be the bad guy in disguise. And I think there's a cautionary tale there. That the title shouldn't make the individual makes the title. So we need to watch these individuals and not assume that because they've been given a position of power or a title, that they are somehow to be trusted, that that's an inherent trust. No. We need to be vigilant. Because again, this story being told by a man happened when he was a boy. Imagine the fear of that boy. And imagine that boy being able to go home and talk to his macho father about what happened. That's an untenable situation in my mind. So I'm very glad, very, very glad that Virgil got to share that with us.
Did when you were putting the book together, was there ever times where you would think back or talk with some of the authors and things in here that put all this together, and ask questions about more details or something that would be troubling or?
We all communicate fairly well with our contributors, and some of them actually were longtime friends that we solicited for work, and there were many conversations that took place. But because of the nature and the vulnerability and the privacy of some of these assaults that were put on paper, we tried not to go beyond what they were willing to share. If in conversation they wanted to talk a little bit more about it, absolutely. Any of the editors were eager and willing to have that conversation. But we didn't want to break down whatever walls were remaining to the contributors, right? We wanted them to come forward on their own steam, in their own time, and through their own way of being empowered.
Okay. Caridad, we're out of time here. I want you to take in the next 30 seconds here about a wrap up real quick for us, and with your final thoughts that you want people to take away, if you could.
Well, thank you to everyone who's been here today. This book grabbed poets and writers' response to sexual assault, empowerment, and healing. These are all stories that have been collected, which, by the way, has never been done before. This is the first anthology written by survivors of sexual assault. and I'd love for everyone to pick one up. There's a lesson for everyone, and more than anything else, I'm grateful to have been able to give these contributors a voice and to know that those voices rise in a chorus for all of us to hear.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us, Steve.
Caridad. Thank you for listening, and we hope you have enjoyed today's discussions. This has been Coastal Progressive and Rainbow Forum on Society Bites Radio, and I have been your host, Steve Ryan.